Hospitality is actually a pretty slippery concept, even though it seems really straightforward. I didn't realize until I started researching that the small differences can really make things change quite a bit. The concept, the way it holds across different cultures and across different times. Mostly it seems to depend on who you're extending your hospitality to. Is hospitality for your family? Is it for your friends? Is it for guests? Is hospitality for strangers? And the concept of hospitality does encompass all of this, but it seems like hospitality to your family versus hospitality to, say, refugees is just on a completely different level. It entails almost entirely different things. And of course, in difficult times for the person extending the hospitality, again, it takes on a completely different character. So many people have tried to define hospitality. They've tried to give it a foundation, even in the study of philosophy. Immanuel Kant, his description I thought was really compelling. To him, hospitality is a natural right. It's possessed by everyone by virtue of their right to communal possession of the earth. Basically, to him, we were all welcome on this planet because we're all of this planet. The argument's very, very simple. If you're from this earth, then you have a right to the earth. That's easy to extend to any person, and then to any animal, to any plant, to anything. Kant was a really interesting guy, a philosopher who thought and engaged deeply with the world, but he never left his hometown of Königsberg in Germany. For him personally, he probably had trouble conceiving of a place where most people wouldn't know each other and wouldn't care about each other. So the urban life of today would have been almost unthinkable to him, I imagine. He was actually very like another group of people that I want to talk about a little bit later. Kant was agnostic, but raised in a very strict Protestant household. He grew up surrounded by the Christian idea of what hospitality meant, which comes mostly from the Greek and Levantine ideas about that. There's a line in Hebrews, that line that we've already read today, actually. It really gets right to the concept, their concept of hospitality, which said, be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels without knowing it. And the reason that this so perfectly illustrates the Judeo-Christian concept of hospitality is in the word strangers. Because in the classical world, strangers were really often seen as problems. In Greek myths, strangers are the gods in disguise a lot of times. And if you're not careful, those strangers could and would curse you or kill you for giving the wrong sort of hospitality. The Torah and the Bible spend many, many passages telling people over and over again, strangers should not be reviled, but welcomed. The flip side of this suggests that they actually needed to say it a lot to get the point across. Hospitality is a virtue, but in Judeo-Christian literature, it's one that extends almost specifically to strangers and outsiders. The original word is ger, G-E-R, which specifically means an immigrant or an emigrant, a person who left their real home and came to a new place. There really was no concept of a stranger who came from the same place as you. And I wonder a little bit how different our modern interpretations of the Bible would be if the line was reading the way it should, which is, be not forgetful to entertain refugees, for thereby some have entertained angels. Now, one of the early church fathers, John Chrysostom, it's Chrysostomos, which means golden-mouthed. He was apparently quite a speaker. He extended the concept of hospitality further than it had ever been extended in pre-Christian times or early Christian times, when it was thought of as this obligation that you had to perform. As Archbishop of Constantinople, Chrysostom preached constantly about the power of giving, right, as a form of elevated hospitality. He said, what good is it if your Eucharist table is overloaded with golden chalices while your brother is dying of hunger? Start with your brother and then adorn your altar. To Chrysostom, I think charity should be like hospitality. It should be personal. And when it becomes personal, it transforms both the recipient, but also the giver. He called it washing the hands of your soul, which is a really great line. By performing hospitality, the giver and the recipient are both changed, and they're changed for the better. Now, Islam, which is the other Abrahamic faith, is embedded really deeply, first and foremost, in the culture of the Bedouins. And for the Bedouins, hospitality was not considered voluntary the same way it was in the classical world or even in the Bible, where there's this sort of entreaty, right? To be nice to people that you don't know, because then something good might happen to you, right? But that did not exist in the Bedouin culture. And so it also didn't exist really in Islam. The reason for this is because the idea of turning someone away from your food and water and shelter in the desert would very likely mean that person's death. And hospitality in a place like the desert was a necessity, wasn't a luxury, wasn't a choice that you could make. It was something that was just at the very core of everything that you should do. So I wanted to use Moses as my example, talking about these two different faiths, because in modern movies, Moses gets this really fantastic, life-saving hospitality in Midian from the Bedouins. And, Moses is the most important prophet in Islamic tradition besides Muhammad. And so I thought that I was going to find this really great moralistic story in the Quran about hospitality. But in the Quran, Moses isn't saved from death. He's actually just looking for a job. And he helps the daughters with their flocks because he's hoping to find work, because of course he was just exiled. So it's a lot less exciting. It's actually probably a little more realistic retelling of Moses' story, because, what person in Egypt would walk into the desert unprepared for traveling, But the point here is the actions were the same. It didn't matter if Moses was dying or if Moses was perfectly healthy. You welcome the traveler. You welcome the traveler with generosity. In fact, karam, which is the word for generosity, is an integral part of hospitality in this culture. And the Islamic ethical system is really deeply rooted in these basic ideas of generosity and hospitality. In fact, hospitality can't exist without generosity. One is necessitating the other. And really interestingly, the word stranger does not appear in the Quran. In early and medieval Islam, it actually was not a known category. People were referred to as travelers. They were referred to as guests. We saw that in the reading. Consider that visiting friends are a necessary custom, or an enemy perhaps, but you could make them your friend. This sort of real gentle pejorative term that we have, stranger, which always denotes somebody that's other than us, that really wasn't part of early Islam. And that reminds me a lot of Kant, who never left his hometown, who probably saw everyone as deserving of hospitality because they shared the space. There was no one from outside, because we all are from this earth. There are multiple commandments in the Quran to give shelter, to feed others, to look after people who need help. There are no strangers. The reasoning goes that God's giving knows no limits, and the faithful must try to emulate God and give with no limits. So generosity and giving, they reflect God's nature. But the actual practice of hospitality, the actual practice of it definitely has limits, because you can't do everything. You're just one person. And there are obligations to both the host and the guest of hospitality. Mona Siddiqui said, "This is because hospitality is real. It is not an ideal. It's time consuming. It's emotionally and sometimes even physically demanding." Dr. Siddiqui literally wrote the book on hospitality. in 2016. It's titled Hospitality in Islam. And she places this concept of hospitality within Islamic theology. She herself is a recipient of the Order of the British Empire. She is a professor of interreligious studies at the University of Edinburgh. Having lived her life between Karachi, Pakistan, and the UK, her perspective on what hospitality means is probably more nuanced than the average person's. She has a great story, though, about receiving hospitality in her book that I want to read for you. When I was an undergraduate in the 1980s, studying French and Arabic, I went to Cairo for the first time as part of my year abroad. After arriving at my prearranged accommodation in a relatively poor suburb of the city, I had to wait outside for a while as keys and rooms were being sorted out. I stood there with my new suitcase and new expectations and looked around anxious and curious at the dust, animals, and poverty around me. A young woman with a small child was watching me as she squatted near the doorstep of my flat. She stared at me for a while, and after some time, I saw her get up, find a large piece of cardboard, dust it clean, and place it on the doorstep. She patted on it, beckoning me to sit down and take the weight off my feet. I smiled at her nervously, knowing that she had made a special effort for a new guest in the neighborhood. I was neither friend nor enemy, but a stranger to whom she had reached out. I was unknown to this neighborhood, and they were unknown to me. Later, as I was getting settled in the flat, 2 young children came up and spoke to me in the local Arab dialect. I couldn't understand what they were saying and became slightly impatient at their repeated visits and knocking on the door. That evening, though, I discovered that they had been sent by their mother, the same woman, to ask if I needed anything because I was a guest in their midst. I felt ashamed and ungracious. I can recall many such experiences, but it's important to press deeper, to recognize that hospitality is fundamental to life. It's not only expressed in acts we perform and gifts we give. It is, more importantly, a state of mind, a generosity of spirit that lies at the core of human hospitality, making hospitality the virtue which defines humanity itself. So going back to Dr. Siddiqui's initial quote, which is that hospitality can be demanding. It can feel demanding because it's real. It's not an ideal. And so we're put into this quandary. That woman who kept sending her kids to make sure Siddiqui was okay, she was taking a lot of time out of what was probably a no doubt very busy day to care about a stranger. Hospitality can define your humanity, but it's also sometimes hard and it's uncomfortable. It's not airy, a concept like, reflection or spiritualism, which you can achieve by being alone with your thoughts. Hospitality requires us to act in order to be practiced. We have to prepare to unsettle ourselves. And then we have to actually unsettle ourselves in order to help another person. There's an evangelical pastor named Brian McLaren. He's sort of a progressive evangelical. He compared the willingness to work with the actual act of work, right? Not just, I'd be very willing to do that, but actually I'm going to do it and I'm doing it right now. He wrote that the Christian witness, which is a very Christian concept, the witness to Christ, this is Christ-centered, but ultimately it's very weak. Witnesses only watch. What is needed, he said, is a witness, not a witness. Working with people, not standing by and watching what happens with empty hands. So how do we create an environment like that in our lives? I say lives and not spaces or community because that's really what it comes down to, I think, for me, is where do we make time for others out of our own lives? It's one thing to give someone space, to tolerate their presence or their actions, or even to give someone food or water as the Bedouins would. But it's another thing to welcome a person into your life where they will, of course, take up your time and your energy, even if it's just in some small way. And tomorrow is October 11th, which is a big day. It's National Coming Out Day. I don't know if everyone is aware, October 11th is always National Coming Out Day. It's a kind of holiday in the LGBTQ community. It's actually been observed since 1988, when a few leaders within the community decided that instead of responding defensively to what was, the late 80s was a very rampant anti-LGBTQ sentiment, they were going to put a more positive spin on the concept of coming out of the closet, as it was called. In 1988, this was a lot riskier than it is today in the United States. Today, I feel like National Coming Out Day has a sort of celebratory air. People like to wear their pins on that day. They like to wear their pride flags on that day. But at first, it was understood that the people who were using October 11th to come out, either privately to their families or publicly, as some celebrities do, were sometimes really risking their lives to make that choice. And even today, the choice to make a public proclamation can be a double-edged sword. It's a heavy decision for people to make. Preston Mitchum is an activist and writer. In 2013, he wrote an article for The Atlantic, which is called "Don't Disparage the Closet." And it's very, very good. I encourage anybody to go Google it and read it. It's free to read. He says, this is a quote, "Focusing so intensely on coming out places the burden on the individual to brave society, rather than on society to secure the safety of the individual," which is such a striking way of framing it. Allies and friends, they want to participate, right, in the celebration of someone's announcement often. But what happens then is that if you are a friend and an ally, then we have to also create a safe and welcoming space for those people to exist without fear. We have to make time, right? Luckily, I feel like that's really what Unitarian Universalism is about. From the first principle to the seventh principle, our imperative is really always focused on making space and making time more than anything. We make time for justice. We make time for peace. We make time for truth. We make time for encouragement and community. We make time for someone to feel safe enough to speak their truth. I think that's the goal of UU. One of my best friends actually came out to me on National Coming Out Day in 1988. I was very small in 1988. It was in 1998, and I didn't actually know what National Coming Out Day was in 1998, but I was the first person he had ever said it out loud to, and it took him a long time to say it. But, that's all he really needed from me. He needed me to be a safe space for him. He needed me to offer him my personal hospitality, right? Offer my time, be a sanctuary, give him a place to feel appreciated and loved and accepted. And to me, that's really hospitality, right? It's making someone feel safe, to feel welcome to a bit of your time and to a bit of your life. So hospitality, even though it has these spiritual roots, we're talking divine mandates, Hindu, Shinto, Islam, Judaism, all of these different spiritual faiths are talking about really the same thing, right? It's so simple. You make time, you create room, just care about another person's reality, and then offer your time and yourself to make their reality just a little bit better. It's the small improvement. You don't have to have God overhead chiding you to be hospitable. We don't need Zeus throwing a thunderbolt at anybody to have us be welcoming to people that we don't know, or even welcoming to people that we do know, but who need extra time from us. You just need your heart open and welcoming. When we all do this, I think, we won't need something like National Coming Out Day, because we'll all have accepted each other for who we are. We'll all know what we know about each other. But in the meantime, while we wait for that day, I feel like we can all follow Desmond Tutu's advice, of course. He was our reading. Desmond Tutu is one of my favorite Catholic leaders, really. And I'm not Catholic, but I've always thought that he had such a fantastic grasp on what it means to be human, and how faith really goes across religions. It has nothing to do with necessarily what religion you are. And he just captures everything so perfectly. His advice from our reading is just tell the world there are no outsiders. We all belong within the circle of care.